Hello and welcome back to the Azure Terraformer. Today I have another code review for you, this time from my long-term member Dan Kitch. So let's go check out what Dan has in store for me. So I know Dan's been kind of bouncing around between different topics. This Entra-PIM stuff has been something that he's been looking at. So looks like he's added resources to create Entra-PIM groups and role assignments based on local role definitions. This includes handling both privileged and non-privileged roles. Okay. And then in role settings, we're defining role management policies for specific roles, including settings for eligible assignment rules, activation rules, notification rules. Okay. Introduce local variable to define roles, their settings, including display names, privilege status, and members. Okay. So let's go check this out. I have a general idea of what he's trying to accomplish. I'm not an Active Directory or an Azure Active Directory or an Entra ID administrator, full disclosure. So I don't know if I can truly judge like the functionality that Dan's trying to achieve, but I can sure as heck look at the infrastructure as code to see, what might be causing problems. So one thing right off the bat, right, it looks like we have in our data source here, we have what I would consider an unstable iterator, right? We have basically like we're calculating a bunch of stuff inside of this iterator. I've seen this where people use unstable iterators where they like copy pasta the unstable iterator, but then they have two blocks that are dependent on essentially the same iterator, but because they just copy pasted the unstable iterator, it kind of comes back to bite them in the butt. I don't know if that's what's happening here. I suppose if I looked throughout this code and tried to find this exact for each loop, I could see if it happens. Looks like this is the only time. I'm just gonna say might recommend extracting into a local just for readability. I don't like nested stuff, and honestly, like I'd have to wrap my head around like, what are we doing with a toSet and a flatten? So it looks like there's a local somewhere else in this code base that might have like a hierarchy of these things elsewhere. So if we already have a local.roles, why not just flatten it, and create a flattened roles like local that we can use other place. So that's about all I'll say there. Let's see. So this is an Azure AD user that we're creating. So we're trying to get a reference to these user identities that are going to become members of a PIM group. Okay. So now we're getting Azure Active Directory roles, and we are basically we're doing another for each where we're iterating across these roles. Again, I would probably extract this as a local for testability. So for readability and testability. And it looks like this is just iterating across local.roles and grabbing role.members, which makes sense. Like you're going to try and create a user data source for each member. And then this, you're trying to get a you're provisioning a directory role for each role that you define within this collection. Okay, so this is making sense. We have some local that is our database, essentially, and we're iterating across that database with two lenses. One is looking for the users in this quote-unquote in-memory database or in config database, and then one is looking for the roles in this config database. So interesting. So now we have an Azure AD group, and now we have more unstable iterators. I'd probably break this into a local as well. I'm becoming a broken record on these unstable iterators. I just don't like nested for eaches in the iterator meta argument. Like it's just I think a bit much, right? Especially often these for each iterators need to be reused across multiple blocks potentially, right? So now it does not. So far, I have not seen a place where we're using the same iterator. Oh, and actually, look at this. Like we're doing if role is privileged or not privileged. So that's kind of interesting. And so we're doing a eligibility schedule request if the role is privileged, and we're doing an assigned role, a role assignment, if the role is privileged. So I don't even know, like role eligibility schedule request. I don't even know what this is, right? Let's just look what this thing does. So permission required to create the resource, role eligibility. Okay, those are the permissions we require. This doesn't really tell us a whole lot. It almost looks like this is a request that we're going to create for somebody. Let's go ask ChatGPT. Because I legitimately don't know like what these two things are. Request eligibility for directory, role assignments in Azure Active Directory. It works in conjunction with, it's a control. So eligibility versus active role assignments. This is kind of what I thought. So essentially, like it seems like if you're in this eligibility group or something, it means that somebody can request you to be granted temporary permissions. Whereas, here we go. Used to implement just-in-time access. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. And then Azure AD Directory role assignment. This is like a stable role assignment that's permanent access. Yeah. So, okay. That makes sense to me. So, basically, we have two groups of users or roles, I guess. Some that are privileged, some that are not. And the principal ID are these groups. And the PIM groups are defined in these roles. So essentially, we're going to create an Azure AD group. And then for each Azure AD group, we're either going to put that Azure AD group into a eligibility schedule request or just a directory role assignment. Now, these directory role assignments, these are like Entra level role assignments, unlike Azure role assignments, which we know, right, grant us permissions within like an Azure subscription or an Azure management group or whatever, right? You assign, but I think they work the same way, right? But they operate at the tenant level within Entra. So basically, you need to have just like the Azure one, you need a principal, and then you need a role definition, which this is just like a role ID. This is the Entra equivalent of an Azure role definition, and you link them together. Now, the scope, which we have in Azure role assignments, isn't required because when you're doing an Azure AD directory role assignment, the scope is implied as the tenant, I presume. It makes sense to me, right? Now, maybe there's a default scope. I don't know. I'd have to go look at this resource to see if there's other things on it. No. Yeah. No, there is. So there's a directory scope and an app scope, which that's interesting. So that would basically mean that you could, and Entra is quite sophisticated, right? Like, so when you register different applications, this appears to be like a way that you could grant specific application access within the tenant, as long as those applications are properly registered with the Entra tenant. And it looks like app scope and directory scope are mutually exclusive. Yeah. And you have to go look at the documentation, which sometimes you just gotta read the manual, man. Of course, this documentation doesn't look super. Oh, here it goes. Yeah, this is actually pretty nice. Identifier of the app scope. I'm going down a bunny trail here a little bit just for my own learning. I hope you guys get value out of this too, but this is an area of Entra that I have not explored, so it's kind of yeah, this might come in handy someday. The scope of an assignment determines the set of resources for which the principal has been granted. Yeah. App scopes that are defined and understood by a resource application only for entitlement management. So I would imagine that when we say understood by multiple applications, when you go to Entra and you look up different role definitions, those role definitions might grant you access to different apps. Oh, and that's interesting. So this is kind of what I was thinking. I'm digging back to Active Directory classic days. Dear God, did I just coin that term? Don't let the marketing people hear me say that, okay? Anyways, it kind of reminds me of OUs back in old school classic Azure, Active Directory, where you'd have essentially your tenant and then organizational units. I guess there would be a root OU. I don't know what that's called, if it has any special name, but then it looks like within Entra we can define administrative units. So this might grant permission to do, certain tenant-based role definitions, but within the scope of an administrative unit. So you don't have global access to do that. And actually, this might solve my problem of creating and managing my own groups. If I granted group management access to somebody, I wouldn't necessarily have to do it for the entire scope. I could just do it for an administrative unit, and then we would democratize group management. And as long as you're creating a group within that administrative unit, theoretically, then you'd be fine. And I can grant you group read write all within that administrative unit, and you can go forth and have a great time, and you don't mess with other administrative units. Yeah, I don't know. I guess the question is, can you create a group? An Entra ID group within the scope of an administrative unit. I don't know. Anyways, interesting stuff. Back to the thing here. So I get the general gist. Oh, look at that. Directory scope is root. Okay. That's cool. So yeah, now I understand what he's doing there. The principle is, of course, these groups that we're setting up previously. The roles are these roles that he's setting up previously. And I'm assuming these roles are built-in roles, because otherwise he'd have to have permissions assigned to them. So just like with role assignments in Azure, when you set a role definition name, it'll go look up a built-in role definition rather than you go build your own. So I suspect that's what's going on here. Of course, you don't actually have to go look up the role definition when you do the role assignment and then link it to the role assignment. With Azure role assignments, you can just use that's built into the role assignment itself. Here, you wouldn't have to pass in the role ID. You'd just pass in the name of the built-in role, and the resource itself would go do the lookup for you, right? It would ultimately write the ID there. Now, we still have unstable things, right? Now, I'm still going to advocate. I'm still pushing for extracting these as locals, because I just don't like having such complex logic embedded in a resource block. And honestly, I don't know. Could we refactor this to, not, maybe we have one query and then we modify the query to just, find where it's not privileged. That would be interesting, but I don't know. I think this might be the most concise way to do it, actually. Yeah, but I just don't like how they're hard coded there. That's just me. Now this is getting super tricky because he kind of has to hard code it here because he's doing he's grabbing the value off the each and iterating across that. So he literally cannot extract this as a local. Not possible. Because the each is the item from this local that he's iterating on. So this is big O of notation 2. Now, my question here would be, can we break this down instead of big O of notation 2 and use I'm pretty sure there's a group membership resource. Group member. Yeah. So I definitely like this. This would be a good way. So this is big O to the second power, which essentially is a loop of a loop. Not super easy to maintain. Consider splitting group membership into its own resource. Now, that would mean he's going to have to create a flat list of user and group links, because this would require you to create a flat list of user group links rather than loop of a loop. But anyways, there's a lot of looping going on. So I think when we get to the actual data that we're looping through, I think we're gonna kind of understand what we should do here. So now this is kind of scary. So now we're doing spearfishing into this PIM group and accessing a specific instance of a PIM group that we created. So now we are spearfishing, essentially treating application administrator as a fixed entity rather than a sibling within a collection. And I would say, this is when you start seeing this, we're doing a whole bunch of looping, but then now we're starting to see logic that's only pertinent to a specific item in that list. This might be the point. This is kind of like a fork in the road, right? It's is my approach looping really the best way of doing this, or is each of these group PIM groups that the Azure AD groups, or each of these Azure AD groups, kind of unique snowflakes that require handcrafting. It's something. This is very similar to actually what I ran into with Abdul in his code review, right? Because Abdul was trying to do everything. I think management and group role assignments. And he was trying to treat them all the same, but really they were hard coded, right? So I don't know. I think we still haven't gotten to the hard coded stuff yet. So we don't know yet. This is Spearfish number 2. Help desk administrator, which I presume they are, yep, there we go. There are items in this list here, right? So this is almost identical to what Abdul is doing, but with a different context. Basically, Dan is setting up a list of complex objects with nested objects, and then he's trying to iterate across it, and he's got so he's like this object is kind of simplifying things, right? I mean, that's fair. It's kind of simplifying stuff because it does make things a little bit simpler to look at. Like if I'm just going to go and edit this, this collection, I don't have to go in and monkey around with all the code, right? This is unnecessary. But the question is like, does the code that it yield, is this beneficial to us? So I would almost question, right? Like is this complex? If we change the what do you call that? Like when you look at something from a different angle, they call in data science they call this like you slice it from a different dimension. Yes, if we look at this from a different dimension, maybe we can come up with a better way to structure this. I'm almost thinking, right? Like I like the simplified interface here. I just don't like all the iteration, So like it seems like what we're trying to do here is for each of these roles, right? For each object in this list, what do we have? Well, we have a collection of these users, which maps to, I almost need this side by side. And we're going to scroll down here. We're going to look at the structure, right? So this is the structure, and then this is the resources that we're producing, right? So for each for each item in this members, right? I'm going to go grab the user. I'm going to get a reference to the user. Okay, got it. Then let's skip the role, right? Then for each member, oh my gosh, PIM group member. So this PIM group member here. Yeah. So for each of these users that I'm grabbing, right, from this members collection, ultimately. So this members collection is driving this Azure AD user thing, right? And so ultimately this members collection is also driving the members within this Azure AD group. Yeah. So I am basically taking for each role in this collection, and I'm creating this stuff. Let me open up OmniGraph and let's graph this out. Okay. So I've got this structure here. I've got a collection of roles, right? And then I have members. Roles have members. This is the data model that Dan has created. Okay? And there's quite a few members, right? And so for each role, like I have a bunch of members, right? Now, what am I creating? What actual resources am I creating for each of these things? Well, first of all, I am creating an Azure AD user. We'll call this a data.azure AD user. We'll drop the data. I mean, you guys kind of know what I'm talking about here, right? So for each member, I'm creating an Azure AD user. So this is a one-to-one relationship. And then I'm going to create an Azure AD directory role. Okay. And I'm going to do that for each role display name, basically. Like, so I'm taking the role display name. So I'm iterating through each object in this collection here, grabbing the role display name. So we're going to get application administrator, attack simulation administrator, help desk administrator, yada, yada, yada. We're going to get all those. We're going to get all those folks, right? So for each role, I'm creating one of those things. And then for each role, I'm going to create an Azure AD group. That's pretty much what's happening, right? So that's yet another resource that we're going to be creating. Okay, Azure AD group. And then so this is kind of obfuscated from us, but like I mentioned, we're actually creating another thing, you know, which is, what is this? Azure AD group member. Azure AD group member. I'm creating one of these for every member that I have in this collection, right? Okay, what else am I creating? Now this is going to get a little sticky, right? So the Azure AD directory role eligibility scheduler request. So now the question is, if the role is privileged, so this is at the role level, right? If the role is privileged, then I want to take the group and create this thing. Yeah, this Azure AD role eligibility request, that's a lot. I'm gonna have to paste and match style. Dear God, it's humongous. Okay, so we got one of these things. And again, now remember, this is actually being created at the role level. There's one of these per role, right? That's what's happening. One of these per role, okay? And it's either this thing or it's this thing. So if I go copy pasta this, and then copy pasta the name here, right? So I'm either gonna have, you know, this role assignment thing, or I'm gonna have this thing. But it's all at the role level, right? And it's all driven off of whether the role is privileged or not, okay? So that's kind of a crucial thing. Let me see if I can just, I'll try and create like a fancy if, you know, symbol here, like if you're gonna do is privileged, right? Call this is. I always forget how to spell privileged. Privileged, yes or no? So if I make this bigger, then if it is privileged, what? So not privileged. I don't know. It looks like we're doing this eligibility request if the role is privileged. But that seems incorrect. That seems kind of backwards to me. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Dan, you'll have to go check that out. I'm also going to say, like, should this be created if privileged is true? It seems like we should have just-in-time access if not privileged, right? Just an observation from a layman's perspective. Like literally, I don't know Entra ID administration. You know, that's not my wheelhouse. So like it just, as an architect, like I generally understand what privileged access management and just-in-time access management like is about. So I know how I'm knowledgeable, but like I don't have hands-on experience with this. So that's where I'm like, I don't know. This kind of smells funny. It seems like you should want, if my assumption is correct that this is like the just-in-time access, and then this is the long-lived access, then I would assume that like if privileged is true, then you'd want the long-lived access. If privileged is not true, then you'd want temporary access granted. But I don't know. That's just me. Who knows? Yeah. So anyways, so basically with this structure, right? What is happening is that basically Dan is creating a structure where we basically he's treating the roles as if they're an array, right? Which means we have to create arrays for all of these things, right? And we have to have like complex iteration for all of these little sub resources. Like so, right? So basically we're doing for each like this, like crazy, right? For each everywhere. So we have for each, all over the place. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And then on top of that, we have inside of our group, we have like, okay, we're gonna also do like a for each, from the members. And basically like what he's doing is, because he's already for eaching right here, right? He's for eaching the role and then for eaching the members. He's doing a kind of double for each, right? Where we got a for each of the members, like for each of the role, and then for each of the members produces an Azure AD user. And then what he's got to do ultimately is he's going to have to for each again to create these group members. Of course, he's doing it using a nested block, which I mean, that's one way of doing it. You can do it that way. You don't have to do it that way. Now, this right down here is the way Dan's doing it. Okay. And this is basically, how do I call it? We'll call this Dan's approach. And I cover this design principle in my book, actually. And it comes down to like encapsulation, where you want to do module encapsulation. And what I would argue is that basically because I'm gonna highlight where the encapsulation is happening, right? And it's pretty straightforward, right? Dan's encapsulation, we're gonna do no fill. Okay, we're gonna do 15, right? Like his encapsulation is everything, all the things, right? Basically, there's no encapsulation, right? We're not encapsulating anything. Now, what I would say is, if we were to basically create like a module that would be around just one role, right? And we say, look, I'm not gonna iterate across all the roles. Like my module my module is going to produce one role with all of its members and all that stuff. And so what are the inputs, right? Well, the inputs to this technique of encapsulation would be a single object, right? Well, really, it's a single instance of role. A single. That's the input to this thing, to this individual module. Now, the input to Dan's module right now is basically like a collection of roles. Now, the fact that each role in Dan's collection has an attribute that's actually a list in of itself has no bearing on the complexity, that he's encapsulating, right? So we take a collection of roles, we iterate on those roles in various different ways and poop out 1, 2, 3, 4 resources. And then for each role, we iterate on its members and we poop out like a bunch of user IDs and we associate them with a bunch of group memberships, right? That's what's happening here. Now, what I'm saying is, if we set the responsibility of this module, and this is what I'm highlighting here. This is the module. I'm going to set the color, right? This module's responsibility is to produce the collection of roles, right? What I'm saying is we should create a new module whose responsibility is much narrower than produce all the roles. What I'm saying is this new module should have a different responsibility, which is just generate one role. And if we think about it from that perspective, what is the structure of a single role? Well, a single role for each item in that object list, we need one Azure AD directory role. We need one Azure AD group. We need N references to existing users, and we need N group members, right? So now we still have to do some for eaching here, but there's not a lot. Now, so if the scope of this module is focused on encapsulating a single role definition, then it becomes the complexity becomes much smaller. We have big O notation 1, right? We have one-to-one mappings. These are super easy, right? It's like, okay, yes, like I have this role. I'm gonna hard code one of these guys. Okay, I have some logic where I have to decide if I'm privileged or not. If I'm privileged, do this. If I'm not privileged, do that. Great. That's not that complex, right? You have an if conditional. The if conditional is not nested within a for each loop, right? Now that we've encapsulated this, how do we bring this up to the actual level that Dan wants to solve, which is like, dude, I want to pass in a collection of roles, okay? We can still do that. So then we create this module, we just instantiate inside of Dan's original module, which the yellow represents the original module scope, which is, look, we pass in a collection of roles, and those collection of roles are then iterated upon to create a bunch of resources. Now, in Dan's approach, that collection of roles, we iterate across every single resource, data source that we want. What I'm saying here is, in this module up here, I'm going to take this module, its sole purpose is to basically iterate over this collection of roles and for each an instance of this module, right? So now I'm adding one more for each here, right? And so for all this top level module is doing is taking in the collection of roles and then for eaching them across a module. Now that module is represented by this blue area here, right? And so this blue area here is actually going to be, let me just expand this to include the stuff that it's doing, right? So now you can see, because we've encapsulated a ton of that responsibility into a single module whose focus is much more narrow. Its focus is on, give me a single role I'll create all the stuff that one role needs. Then this top level module, all it has to do, its job is also simpler. It just says, give me a collection of roles and I'll instantiate the right module that's going to go create that individual role. So we have a for each here, and we have a for each, in this root module that instantiates that individual module right here. And then inside the individual module, like we don't have much iteration going on, right? Because the iteration has been extracted outside of the scope of this module and into the parent module, thus making the internal implementation of this module that much simpler, right? Notice, like, how many for eaches do we have in here? We have 1, 2. And then the rest of these are just hard-coded, like stamp, like individual things, right? The structure and the complexity is that much simpler. So, I cover this in my book, Mastering Terraform, where I go over module design principles. I wish I could have dedicated more of my book, Mastering Terraform, to module design, but I just had so much scope. I had so much scope in my book, Mastering Terraform, covering 3 clouds, covering all 3 paradigms, and covering what I think is probably the most critical aspect of grokking, and mastering Terraform, which is applying software development lifecycle, right? Managing, an environment long term, and implementing that software development lifecycle around that, so that you have day 1 and day 2 ops. To me, that's, if I want to distill down to like what the most important thing is to master Terraform, that would be it. But yeah, module design, I definitely wish I had more pages to allocate, but the book's already, in my draft, it was like over 600 pages. I think the final book, after the publisher got their hands on it and did all their font facing and all that stuff, it's down to 494 pages. But I could probably write 200 more pages on module design. It's just a super deep topic, but yeah, this is one of the principles that I do cover in the book, which is extract the iteration outside the module boundary. Thus, the encapsulated scope is much more narrow and much less complexity. So, Dan, I hope this helps you. This might also help Abdul, like if Abdul's looking at this, but in Abdul's code review, I didn't see as much repetitive resources like this. And this is a critical design aspect that makes this encapsulation technique very, very effective. So, yeah, I think that's, I'd have to go back and revisit Abdul's code review. But I got the sense that there was less going on in this blue box, right? And if there's less going on in the blue box, and like, for example, if we just had collection of roles, right, and we just were popping out role assignments, right, which is kind of like one of these things here, right, which I think that's kind of what was happening, then kind of seemed like it was, just stamp it out. Like you don't even need to encapsulate. What are you encapsulating? But I think I did mention something to Abdul about, how, you could potentially create a module like that would stamp out the role assignments for a management group. Like, it depends on how you think about it, and depends on the dimension you want to look at it. Are you looking at it, from the perspective of for this management group, who has access to what, right? Or are you thinking about like for this identity or group, right? What management groups do they have access to, right? It's like identity, managing identity and role-based access control through infrastructure as code. There's different lenses that you can look at the relationship between the principles and the permissions that you're granting. So it's like what lens fits your use case most effectively. That's the age old question. Like how do you do that? Potato, right? But it's all the same thing. Anyways, I hope you guys found this useful. Dan, sorry for the delay on this code review, but good stuff. Keep it coming, man. I definitely got to get a Code Ninja meetup here going. Probably when I'm down in Florida, so maybe November, December timeframe. But this is great stuff. Thank you for the Brainbuster, and keep it coming, Code Ninjas. And if you have Terraform code that you want a review like this done on, definitely consider smashing that join button. Hopefully you're already a subscriber, but the Azure Terraformer does have channel membership, which the Code Ninja level will get you access to my code reviews like this. So you can submit a pull request on GitHub and have me go torch your code. Just kidding. Like have me give you constructive criticism, opinionated constructive criticism. Of course, these are my opinions, right? So, take it for what it is. But if you find that valuable, then consider becoming a Code Ninja right here on the Azure Terraformer, and submitting your pull request to me, and I'll go through it, and we'll work that much closer together. Anyways, that's it. Until next time, this is the Azure Terraformer signing off.